Now, voters across the European Union went to the polls this past week to vote for the parties they want to represent them in the European Parliament, which is one of the legislative bodies of the EU and the only one whose members are directly elected by EU citizens. Thomas Sparrow is political correspondent with our partners DW, and he joins us with results and implications of the vote. Thomas, good to speak to you. Now, why don't you bring us some of the highlights of the vote that just happened?
One of the highlights generally is the fact that the EU Parliament will be a bit more fragmented in the coming years. The two big blocs that had dominated the European Parliament, the centre-left bloc and the centre-right bloc, lost many voters to other parties or other groups, and that has to do in particular with two sets of parties. On the one hand, the Greens had a surge in voter popularity, in voter turnout in these elections, in particular in countries like here in Germany. And on the other hand, the far right in various countries, in Italy, for example, also in the UK and France, they managed to attract many voters. And that is the reason why, in general, the EU Parliament will be much more fragmented in the coming years than what it has been so far.
Were there any interesting voting patterns across the continent that emerged?
In many countries, voter turnout actually increased, something that was positively commented by political leaders and a sign in a way that Europe and the European debate and European topics are becoming more important for voters in the continent. European Parliament elections had always been seen as sort of second-class elections in comparison to national elections in the respective countries. But it does seem that in this case, voters were particularly interested or even particularly worried about the future of the European Union, and that in part explains why many more than before in many countries actually went to the polls. That is one clear conclusion that politicians drew from the European Parliament elections.
That's interesting, an increased turnout. What do you think that means in terms of how Europeans are approaching the governance of their continent?
Well, just think about the fact that the previous European Parliament elections in 2014 were about a very different Europe. Since then, we had the refugee crisis. Since then, we had Brexit. Since then, we had the surge of populist parties across the continent. So this means that Europe, in comparison to 2014, is a very different place, and one that has certainly generated a lot of debates among voters and among politicians as well. And that explains probably why Europe, in the minds of people who went to the polls on the 26th, played a more important role than what it may have done 4 or 5 years ago. And that also explains why different parties will be represented as well in the European Parliament, that, as I said a minute ago, will certainly be more fragmented than in the past few years.
Right, so fragmented blocs, increased voter turnout, and all the while Brexit, the interesting sideshow to all of this. What do you think this means for the future of Europe?
Well, one immediate aspect that will have to dealt with is who gets the top jobs in the European Union, because it's not only about the European Parliament. Many of the top jobs, ranging from EU Commission President to the head of the Central Bank to the Foreign Affairs representative, they will all pass to someone else. And now is when you have the debate as to who could lead those different positions. There is a system here in Europe called the Spitzenkandidaten system, which basically has said that the person who has led or who was the lead candidate of the main group that won after the elections had the chance of becoming EU Commission President. And in that case, it would have been the job for Manfred Weber, the leader of the center-right political group. But other political leaders, in particular French President Emmanuel Macron, have said that they're not in favor of this system, that they would like to have a candidate who has had political experience in their own country. So that has meant that other candidates have also been discussed, including EU Commissioner Margrethe Vestager from Denmark, or Michel Barnier, who you may know because he has led the EU negotiations on Brexit and who is well regarded here in Europe. So the main issue which will be discussed now is how they can distribute those very important posts. But apart from that, there are also discussions on what this will mean, obviously, for the future of Europe, when you have populist parties playing a more important role in Europe, populist parties that are also described as Eurosceptic parties, and what happens on the other hand, where you also have green parties and liberal parties that are playing a more important role and that will be bringing forward topics that for them are particularly important, in particular the fight against climate change.
Interesting times ahead. Thomas, thank you very much for that update.
My pleasure.
Thomas Sparrow there from our partners DW.